and radio. That's the sections that we're going into, just to sort of get this set up a little bit. And I'll make some general comments, and then I'll hold the rest for next Wednesday. Actually, on Wednesday, I'm going to play for you something really neat. And I'm going to play for you a hip-hop album on Wednesday. And I expect you to like really pay attention to it and write notes on stuff and stuff like that. It's a really cool thing, actually. It's a hip-hop album by Cornel West, who is a PhD professor. He's one of America's leading black intellectuals. He resigned his position from Harvard over a tiff he got into with Lawrence Sumner's, who was this old political hack who got appointed to be president of Harvard, and he insulted Cornell, and Cornell up and quit on him, moved to Princeton, so now Cornell's at Princeton. He's a really smart, cool guy. Some of you might have seen Cornel West because he's, I mean, in addition to just being an extraordinarily prolific academic writer, he's also kind of a popular writer. He's often gets invited to be like a talking head on like Bill Maher and that sort of thing, and he's made a cameo, or he had a small part in one of the Matrix movies, where he was one of the guys on the council. The Matrix movies, by the way, have been noted as being, if there's an example of a text, like in popular culture, a movie, that we might think of as being post-racial, it's The Matrix. Because there's race in The Matrix, but it doesn't really matter. It's a dystopia for sure, because of course the humans have been driven underground, and the Earth has been overtaken by machines, and so it's not exactly a utopian vision of human life. But it has one advantage going for it, which is that there's just no racism whatsoever. It looks like Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, where just everybody's just judged completely by the content of their character, and it doesn't seem to matter who's black and who's white. And there's just like a mix of it going around there. And yet it doesn't, there seems to be no racial tension of any kind and a randomness to it, you know. Neo could have been black. I believe that the first person who was supposed to play Neo was Will Smith, and he didn't take it, but of course we all know that Morpheus is played by, what's the guy's name?
I don't know.
Lawrence
Fishburne.
That's right. Thank you. Is there anyone here who has not seen The Matrix?
You mean like all three, or?
Let's just say the first
or
one.
whatever.
It's the first two that really matter.
Couldn't you say that about the Terminator as well, though? You know what I mean?
Well, no, because the Terminator is so white. Like, there's all white people everywhere you look.
Okay, yeah, the first one. Well, and I guess the second one. But the newer ones that they came out with, where it's gone back in time and it's people versus the machines, you know, like that's the same thing.
You know, I feel like I'm the biggest Terminator fan, yet I haven't seen these ones that you're.
No, the one with the what was
What's that?
The newest one, Christian Bale.
Yeah, with Christian Bale is playing John Connor, and then there's that other dude that was in Avatar. I don't remember his name.
Really?
Salvation, is it?
Yeah.
Terminator Salvation.
Yeah.
Are they good?
Yeah, they're alright.
Action.
Really?
They're like 6% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, if that means anything to you.
I think that's a low rating. So yeah, it means something to me. It means they suck. It means they suck because the Terminator movies, along with the Matrix movies and the Alien movies, and I have to throw in Star Wars, and since I'm on it, Dr. Strangelove in 2001, are like the greatest movies ever made. I love them so much. They're so good. But I digress, actually, and I bring up that racial issue for a reason, because it's a good point of departure for us. Because, you know, I'm just going to, one point that I sort of want to drive home to you when we're thinking about sound recording in radio, is that in this country, sound recording and radio have actually played a huge role in the evolution of racial relations in the United States in a way that you might not generally be aware of. And what I want to do just for a little bit today, hopefully, is just to paint a little bit of a picture to try and get you to think about recorded sound and radio and its significance for race relations in the U.S. So let me start doing that, okay? So first, recorded sound and radio generally grew up together. You had recorded sound ahead of radio a little bit. You know, first there was the phonograph, and then there was radio technology becoming prevalent. And you can see how they were related, because they are both about turning electronic signals into audio signals. And they both came up in the early 20th century. It was the 1920s was the time when radio became a popular medium. And radio was the first popular electronic medium. It was the first broadcast medium. In terms of the vocabulary that I've been using to think about different communication technologies, we would say it was a space shrinking medium, right? Because when you're listening to the radio, you can be really far apart from all these other people who are listening to the radio, or where the source of the sound is, you know, and yet it doesn't matter because you're all having that simultaneous experience, which then you can say it's very time-bound, right? Because the radio exists in an oral sort of a mode. You know, the sound is only there when it's there, and then when it's off, it's not off. Of course, recorded sound is a little bit different, right? Because the whole thing about recorded sound is it's time transcended. You know, if it's on an LP, it's stuck in space, but that LP, the sound that's on there is going to be on there tomorrow, and the week after, and the month after, and the year after. So when you record it, when you combine recorded sound with the radio, you get this interesting time transcending and space shrinking or space transcending type of medium. So it's interesting for that reason. And then so let's think, both those technologies were up and going in the 1920s. The 1920s was a really interesting moment in American history, and I want to try and set the context for you a little bit about what was going on in the 1920s, so that you can begin to understand the significance of how sound, you know, radio and recorded sound intersected with race relations. So let me just paint the picture for you a little bit. So remember, first, the 1920s was, you know, I'm not good at math, but I think about 60 years after the Civil War, so very much the time of the Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. Racism, overt racism, was still very much alive. I mean, you know, we fought a war over whether blacks were people, essentially, or whether they were property, right? How they were going to be treated, that sort of thing. You know, winning a war is one thing, but changing everybody's minds and changing culture is a whole other thing. So really, just because the Civil War was over and slavery became illegal, it didn't erase the problem of race relations in the United States. It just moved it into a different phase, different mix of powers, different set of rules sort of governing the play of, you know, what we might call the unfolding narrative of black liberation, right? It moved it ahead, but it was still a profoundly racist time, right? There was overt racism, you know, the sort of explicitly racist attitudes. I don't like blacks, whites are better than blacks, that sort of thing. And then there was the covert racism, or the systemic racism that would be in the form of Jim Crow laws and segregation and that sort of thing that was all legal. You know, separate education, still separate water fountains. Basically, you know, all kinds of discriminatory practices that were exercised at the voting polls to keep blacks disenfranchised. Just, you know, the Civil War was over, but it was still basically the state of race relationships was terrible. It was just terrible. Characterized by overt racism and a lot of ignorance and that sort of thing, right? So that was very much alive in the 1920s. And then other things that are relevant in the 1920s is, of course, you should be thinking about the fact that at that point, the Industrial Revolution had been up and going for a good 40 or 50 years. And it was just like the heyday of industrial capitalism. And also, we would call it the sort of wild frontier days of industrial capitalism. It was the age, the Gilded Age, the age of the big sort of robber barons and that sort of thing. It was before the minimum wage and 40-hour work week and occupational safety and health laws and child labor laws and things like that. So it was sort of wild frontier days in industrial capitalism. And it was, at that point, you know, the Industrial Revolution was a great game changer in the nature of social and economic organization. And what you had in the 1920s was 40 years of this process where people who had been living in the same town that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were born into, you know, rural, agrarian sorts of places, these people around the country and around the world were being uprooted from those traditional communities and moving to the cities where the industrial jobs were. So from all around the country, you had this massive migration of rural workers to urban areas where they were living in these increasingly densely populated cities, bumping up against people from different cultures all around them. The cities were getting very dense. They would have been very much a sort of racial, ethnic mosaic of people from around the country and around the world into the big American cities. And so it was a time of great change. It was a time where people were cut off from the traditional anchors, the sort of meaningful cultural anchors that defined for them their identity and their relationship with other people around them, and were put into this period of dense population and change. And of course there was a lot of difficulty, a lot of poverty, because you know, you could be working for those factories, but you could be working in a factory 60 hours a week and, you know, not be making a lot of money, and you live in some tenement in the city, packed in there tightly with lots of other people. That would be what the scene was like. You know. But of course the 20s were also a very exciting and fun time. They're oftentimes compared to the 1960s in the United States in terms of new ideas taking hold, in terms of a sort of libertarian spirit where people were sloughing off the sort of old cultural norms and experimenting with new ways of living and new sorts of identities and new styles, you know, new fashions, new music, right? And it was at this time in the 1920s that there emerged this new musical form. And the new musical form had a sort of combination of some old school African rhythms and sensibilities of a kind of exchange between an individual and a group making music in a free-form way, mixed in with European instruments and in the context of social change, and they created what's come to be known as the first great American art form, jazz music, right? Jazz music was like, it took all these different influences and elements that were around and produced something brand new. And really, even though eventually there were white jazz musicians, jazz was created by African Americans in their context, using their history, you know, combination of blues and rhythm and blues and gospel and like I said, sort of African styles, and then using these new world instruments, and they created something utterly brand new. And at first, largely because of who created it, jazz music was met with disdain and scorn and even hostility from white folks, generally speaking. And it was considered this kind of degenerate jungle music, right? But it was getting recorded, it was popular with the Africans, there were radio stations around that started playing it in the 1920s, and it caught on. And it caught on first with white musicians who were hearing it and recognizing that it was something special, and they were starting to get drawn to it. You know, they'd hear it, though, maybe on the radio first, and then they'd wind up going and exploring a little bit in like the Harlem clubs in New York, or the clubs in New Orleans and Chicago, and then they started following it. And what happened was, well, first of all, it's like there's like a narrative arc of jazz. And I'll point this out too because it's relevant. That parallels exactly what we could call the narrative arc of rock and roll. Both jazz and rock and roll were invented by African Americans, adopted by white musicians first, and then it started to appeal to a white fan base. It started to get played by white musicians as well as black musicians. The white musicians in both cases wound up making lots of money and becoming famous, and the black musicians often didn't, you know. And that narrative happened with both of them. But other elements that are similar is that with jazz, what wound up happening was people started hearing the jazz music on the radio and they liked it. I mean, white people started hearing it and they liked it. And then white people started going to the jazz clubs and they liked what they heard. And then of course you had the white musicians starting to play jazz. And suddenly, in this context of what we would define as extreme prejudice, extreme racial bigotry, prevalence of attitudes of white supremacy, and laws that created it, you know, that were explicitly racist. In that context, you started getting white people simply falling in love with this musical form. It had nothing to do, in a way, for them with race relations, except for the fact that they were aware that black people were playing it. But without explicitly being about race, these white folks found themselves in love with black music. And that's a kind of funny position to be in, because, you know, if you're really falling in love with jazz music and you're recognizing it as this, basically this form of artistic genius, you know, incredible technical virtuosity, I should say, that would be involved in being a jazz musician. It was just so obvious to everybody who was a fan of jazz that the people who were making this music were talented geniuses, and thus the whole ideology of white supremacy could just get washed away in a night of listening to jazz, and someone just getting their mind blown by this extraordinary music, and then having this sort of cognitive dissonance going where genius music, supposedly inferior people, how do you reconcile those antithetical ideas? Well, you know, one would get blown away, and the thing that got blown away was the whole ideology of white supremacy for the whites who got into jazz music thanks to the combination of radio and recorded music, right? Because what wound up happening is you turn the radio on and you'd hear this music coming out. And whether you knew black people in your neighborhood or not, you knew who was making that music. And I'm just basically making the argument that for all the significance of rhetoric and arguments and writing editorials and making ethical appeals to why white supremacy is wrong, you know, music comes along in a way was just this incredibly radical and progressive force, right? And it did what argument couldn't do. You know, it created a lived, felt experience in people where they're listening to this music and getting transformed by the music, not engaging in an argument about race at all, just enjoying music. And the pleasure of music became political. It became an anti-racist political force. You know, this very non-political thing, you know, music, when, you know, it's just music, man. You know, it doesn't even have any words. How did it become so political? And yet it was political, right? Because the races started mixing in the cities a lot, in Harlem and in New Orleans and Chicago, in these areas. White people started going to black clubs because they fell in love with the music. And that itself became this very sort of political act, right? And so, and then that whole narrative got repeated again. There was an unbelievable backlash against rock and roll music in the 1950s. And what happened in the 1950s was a lot like what happened in the 1920s. We were still an overtly, explicitly racist country. You know what I mean? Racist attitudes were prevalent and explicitly voiced, not yet driven underground. You know, jazz helped. It moved the process on down the line a little bit. You know, the process of dealing with America's problem with race, right? But it wasn't over thanks to the jazz age. And then it came again in a weird way in the 1950s because it was a very similar thing. Blacks, once again, you know, they took jazz and a little bit of country and honky-tonk and added a few other things to it, and then they created rock and roll. And I'm talking about, you know, Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino. I mean, those guys invented rock and roll in like 1948, 1949. I mean, that's really where it came from. You know, Elvis came, you know, he was from Memphis. He was hearing those black musicians. You know, him and Jerry Lee Lewis and a few others copied that black sound. They put a white face on it, and then that made it palatable for a white audience, right? And the difference between rock and roll and jazz is that with rock and roll, it was all about the kids, right? It was young kids in the 1950s driving around in cars, listening to the DJs spinning rock and roll music that like created this massive popularity of rock and roll. It was popular with young people. And there was an extraordinary racist backlash against rock and roll in the 1950s. Because number one, it was white kids listening to black music. And not only was it white kids listening to black music, but it was a type of music that had this driving beat, and it felt very physical, right? And it had this strong sexual connotation. You know, before rock, literally in the English language, as a, what do you call it, slang, before rock and roll referred to a type of music, rock and roll in like jazz culture was slang for sex, like sexual intercourse. Rock and roll meant, whatever you call it, hooking up or something. It meant actually sex, you know? It actually meant that. So it had that connotation verbally, it had that connotation in the rhythm of the music being so physical, so corporeal, you know, so of the body, right? So appealing to the body. It was considered to be simplistic. It was critiqued in racist terms as being this jungle music, you know, and there was this incredible fear that the combination of the sexuality of rock and roll music, the physicality of it, in the context of the racial boundary that was getting crossed because it was black music for white kids, created this incredible racist backlash, all organized explicitly. This is, I'm telling you, this is the way that they talked about it, around the fear that white kids would start having sex with black kids. It was a huge, that was the way the anti-rock and roll crusaders explicitly talked about it. They especially wanted to save the white girls from the black boys, you know. And by the way, if you ever have seen either of the film versions of Hairspray, right? It's all about that moment. And you can see that. Hairspray is a fictional movie. It takes place in like 1962, 1963, you know, the cusp of the integration movement. And you can see it's these white kids are getting into this black music and their parents are just freaking out over it. And there's even an interracial romance in Hairspray that's really funny. I don't have to show you. But anyway, I'm just trying to get you to think, because you know this class is all about relationships. I'm never just interested in the history of who invented the gramophone and when did it start playing on the radio. It's the relationship between this new medium and the whole social, cultural context in which it's deployed and how it goes back and reorders that context. And I'm just trying to sort of make the point for you that sound recording and radio has a complex history, or it has a complex relationship to the evolution of race relations in this country. And on Wednesday, I'm going to play for you this hip-hop thing, where Cornel West is going to tell you what I just told you, but he's going to do a much better job of it, because Cornel West is a genius, and I'm just a regular guy.
Do you feel like rap and hip-hop are kind of on the same arc of
rock and
roll and jazz?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, hip-hop and rap are yet again another extraordinary innovation by the African American culture that has then been adopted by the white culture and popularized within it, and I think it's helping us. I think hip-hop and rap are great, and I think that the critiques of hip-hop and rap, you know, the gangster rap and this and that, I think a lot of those critiques are in a way similar to the history of critiques of rock and roll and jazz, if only in the fact that those critiques are usually levied by people who have no understanding of the music whatsoever. I mean, Bill O'Reilly should keep his mouth shut about hip-hop and rap because he has no authority on it. He doesn't understand the music, it doesn't speak to his cultural experience, you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that hip-hop and rap are, you know, beyond critique, but they're not for Bill O'Reilly to critique and people like that, you know what I mean? The critiques of hip-hop and rap come from hip-hop and rap fans themselves, you know what I mean? Those are the powerful criticisms. And you'll hear that from Cornel West, because here he is, he's making a hip-hop music, or he makes a hip-hop record, and in the content, like one of the tracks in it is all on the N-word. And he talks about the use of the N-word, and he kind of develops a thesis about it. But he's critiquing the use of the N-word within the sort of family of meanings that are created within rap and hip-hop in a way that makes sense and is respectful of what's going on. You know, uses it in a smart way, is the way I would say it. So yeah, I definitely think so. And I'm such a typical white guy. Yo, can I tell you the rap music I like? Beastie Boys. Jewish rap. They're all three Jewish kids, you know? And then I like some of Eminem. You know, those are the, but now I also like Nicki Minaj a lot. And I don't know if they're black or white or what they are, but this Girl Talk. You know Girl Talk? Do you know Girl Talk? So cool, man. It's so, and Girl Talk is all sampling. Like this, I think it might just be one guy or some group of people, but they'll take like 100 songs and braid them together in a way that just, they're seamless. You can't even, they'll play two songs simultaneously that are completely different, and they sound so great together, and then one of them drops off, and suddenly another one comes in, and then you don't even feel the seam, you know what I mean? Like there are relationships between types of music that you don't even see, and then another one comes in, and the third one drops off. I'll play some Girl Talk for you. How much time do we have left of class?
We're ready right now.
Just play it.
All right. You guys gotta see this, man. It's so cool. Let me go to,